Okay. Very good. Welcome, everyone. So I guess we might as well start. Looks like it's just past 3 o'clock. So it's good. So today's sutta is going to be the Rohitassa Sutta. That's what it's called. It's found in the Anguttara 4, number 45. And this was suggested by somebody, sent an email. Oh, you want to hear about the Rohitassa Sutta? So I said, okay, then let's do the Rohitassa Sutta. It's actually nice to get some ideas, right? People are interested in something, which is always quite nice. And I think it followed on from the talk I gave here a couple of months ago, which was on Buddhist cosmology. And this is kind of a little bit related to these ideas of Buddhist cosmology. So for that reason, I think they wanted to hear about this particular sutta, and it's actually quite interesting. And it's quite simple sutta in some ways, but the implications are quite profound, and for this reason, it's quite nice. So let us see what it has to say. It's only a small part of it, which is really, really kind of exciting, if you like, and the rest of it is fairly straightforward. But nevertheless, let's see how it goes. Okay. Rohitassa Sutta. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Then, when the night had advanced, the young Deva Rohitassa, of stunning beauty, illuminating the entire Jeta's Grove, approached the Blessed One. He paid homage to the Blessed One, stood to one side, and said, "Is it possible, Bhante, by traveling to know, see, or reach the end of the world, where one is not born, does not grow old, and die, does not pass away, and get reborn?" Right? So let's just stop there briefly and just have a quick look at some of the aspects. It's a very short sutta, so we can take a bit more time today to look at some of the details, perhaps. And just first of all, of course, we have this Deva coming to the Buddha, and this seems to have been a fairly common occurrence in those days. And of course, of stunning beauty, right? These come from the Deva Loka. You would normally be very beautiful, been reborn in a higher realm, illuminating the entire Jeta's Grove. And one of the things sometimes you wonder, well, did these things really happen? Did they not happen? Did Devas actually come to the Buddha? If they did, why don't we see the Devas today? How come, there was all these Devas 2,500 years ago, but today we are deprived of these Devas? Why is that? And the answer is not entirely obvious. I don't know if there is any very clear answer to this. One possibility is, of course, that these Devas, they took the Buddha as their teacher. Once the Buddha had passed away, maybe there wasn't anybody else they wanted to take as their teacher. That's one possibility. Another possibility, which I think perhaps is more likely, is that there are Devas around today. And they are around. It's just that we don't normally see them. But, sometimes you hear about people, they see strange sights, right? They see things like lights, weird lights, and sometimes they call them UFOs and that sort of stuff. Maybe those things are precisely Devas. There are all kind of unexplained phenomena happening in our world, which nobody, people think you're nuts if you talk about them. So people kind of, okay, better not talk about this, right? And this is how things get suppressed, because people are afraid of talking about these things, afraid somebody's going to send them to some kind of asylum or something and lock them up. It's unfortunate, isn't it? We can't really talk about things, because if we do, then we get stigmatized and all this kind of stuff. So I think there's various possibilities here of what is going on. Anyway, so I think that these things may very well have happened in those days, and they may happen even in the present day. I've certainly heard about monks who say they have been approached by beings in their meditation. But that was more of a personal experience rather than a kind of experience that everybody could take part in, as it seems it is here. So then he comes to the Buddha and he says, "Is it possible to know and see and reach the end of the world, where one is not born, does not grow old and die, does not pass away and get reborn?" So this is one of those ancient searches that people have always been on, the search to find the end of suffering, right? And in those days it was already quite common at the time of the Buddha to search for the end of suffering by finding the end of birth, old age and death, and the end of samsara, the end of the process of transmigration. That was already something that was fairly established in Indian culture in those days. It wasn't just the Buddhist, there was the Jains, it was also to some extent part of the Brahmanical, the Hindu culture of India at that time. So this was already part of that. So this Rohitassa, who, it's not clear whether he's a Buddhist or not, but he also has these ideas, right? This was already part of the culture, and of course very much part of the Buddhist culture. So he's asking, well, if to find, maybe one way of finding an end to these problems is just to go to the end of the world, right? If you go to the end of the world and you kind of step outside perhaps, right? You find the limit, of the world ends here, take one more step, okay, hooray, outside, right? No more getting born and dying because you had to step outside the whole thing. Is that possible? Something like that is the idea. It's not entirely crazy, it kind of makes sense to some extent, I suppose. So let's see what happens. And then the Buddha replies, I say, friend, that by traveling one cannot know, see, or reach the end of the world, where one is not born, does not grow old and die, does not pass away or get reborn. So the Buddha says it can't be done, which kind of probably makes sense to us. By the way, this sequence of know, see, and reach, these are just synonyms really. To know something, to see something, and to obtain it or reach it are really just different ways of saying the same thing here. Just one of the ways that the sutras always work in this way. You have all these synonyms to say the same thing here. And then comes the part where this Rohitassa explains why he's asking this question. It is astounding and amazing, Bhante, how well this has been stated by the Blessed One. I say, friend, that by traveling one cannot see, know, or reach the end of the world, where one is not born, does not grow old, and die, does not pass away and get reborn. In the past, Bhante, I was a seer named Rohitassa, son of Bhoja, one possessing psychic potency, able to travel through the sky. My speed was like that of a light arrow, easily shot by a firm-bowed archer, one trained, skillful, and experienced, across the shadow of a palmyra tree. My stride was such that I could reach from the eastern ocean to the western ocean. Then, while I possessed such speed and such a stride, the wish arose in me, I will reach the end of the world by traveling. Having a lifespan of 100 years, living for 100 years, I travel for 100 years without pausing, except to eat, drink, chew, and taste, to defecate and urinate, and to dispel fatigue with sleep. Yet I died along the way without having reached the end of the world. So this is what he did. So this is, he tells his this sage, if you like, seer here is like an easy. This is the same word as rishi. You find the word rishi in India today is the same word, exactly the same word that this is referring to. He was the Rohitassa, and he had psychic potency. He had what we often call psychic powers in Buddhism, and he had this ability to travel in through the air. And it says here his speed was, it doesn't sound all that impressive, right? The speed was like a light arrow shot across the shadow of a palmyra tree. It doesn't sound all that impressive, but I guess the point is that if you shoot with an arrow, it is quite fast. That's probably the point here. A firm-bowed archer, one of those big bows which are very strong and firm and can shoot things very fast. His stride is a bit more impressive. It reached all the way from the Eastern Ocean to the Western Ocean. So this presumably means the Eastern Ocean and Western Ocean of India. So India is pretty wide. You're talking maybe at the north of India, it must be maybe close to 2,000 kilometers across, I would guess. So that's pretty good for a stride, right? One step, you do it 2,000 kilometers. Comes in handy if you want to go far. Then, possessing the high speed and stride, these psychic powers, he wanted to find the end of the world. And you can sort of see that. This is a bit like, almost like cosmology and astronomy in the present day. We try to peer out into the universe, trying to see what we can find out. And I guess if you have all these psychic powers, right, you can. It would be interesting to see if you can find the end of the universe. It's a bit like being an astronomer, a cosmologist, trying to find the big picture, whatever. So you can see why that was interesting, and especially if you also we were on a spiritual quest at the same time, trying to find the end of suffering, the end of birth and death at the same time. So that's what he did, and of course when he did that, all he did was traveling, apart from doing the necessities such as eating and sleeping and going to the toilet and this kind of things. So that's all he did, traveling, moving, but yet he died along the way without reaching the end of the world. So the world here, what the meaning of the world is in this particular case, is not perhaps entirely clear. It could perhaps just mean the earth, right? I don't know. But more likely, I think it probably just means the universe as such, and he would travel out into the universe, perhaps. It's very hard to really know exactly what is meant. But the Buddha, of course, he just replied before that you cannot reach the end of the world by doing this. And when the Buddha talks about the world, I think it is fairly clear that what he means is the entire universe. Right? Because as I was talking about when I talked about my talk about cosmology, that the Buddha obviously had an understanding of the universe that was astonishing for that time and age, 2,500 years ago. He obviously knew about the multiple solar systems, right? He talked about different human civilizations out there in the world. He talking about the billion-fold solar systems. He quite likely knew about the expansion and the contraction of the universe. It's absolutely astonishing that somebody could know about these things 2,500 years ago. And we try to find an explanation for how the Buddha could have understood this. It is very hard to see any explanation at all, apart from some kind of special power that the Buddha must have possessed, like remembering past lives or something like that. So when the Buddha talks about the world, I think he obviously means the universe as such. It is interesting that the way Pali is the word loka. It is used almost exactly in the same way that we use the word world in English. When you say or in any, I think, modern European language anyway, world means, right, it can mean a human society. If you say the whole world says, you're meaning the world of human beings, right? Everybody says this. It's exactly that meaning also exists in Pali. Or you can say the world is round, you mean the earth is round. Again, it means the planet. Or you can use the word world can mean the whole universe, right? So in exactly the same way, you have the exact parallel in the Pali language to how this works in English. Which is interesting that some of these concepts are so similar, even though the culture is so different, and the time, obviously, is at a very different time. So, this is what he did, and he couldn't find the end of the universe, so he was doing all this stuff. It may be perhaps slightly interesting as well here is this Rohitassa, he comes down to the Buddha as a Deva, but before that he was this seer, this rishi called Rohitassa. So presumably, because his name is the same, presumably that was his previous life, right? So how did he become a Buddhist? Why is he coming to the Buddha? When did he actually meet the Buddha? What is going on here? And this, perhaps the reason why he comes to the Buddha is because he has heard about the Buddha in the heavenly realm, right? Somebody who was a Buddhist already, passed away, got reborn in the heavenly realm, and they said to him, "Listen, Rohitassa, I've got this really, you should hear about these teachings." And, remember the idea that the Buddha is teacher of gods and humans, right? So it is possible, and this is one of the things, that even in the Devaloka you can kind of become a Buddhist, get faith in these teachings, and then even develop yourself in those teachings, even in the Devaloka. And this might just be an example of that happening here. And then he is obviously impressed by the Buddha because he understands what he is talking about, and obviously understands even more than that. Anyway, so we're just dealing with the initial parts here still, and now we're starting to come into the more meaty part of this sutta. So then he repeats himself, saying, "It is astounding and amazing, Bhante, how well this was stated by the Blessed One. I say, friend, that by traveling one cannot know, see, or reach the end of the world, where one is not born, does not grow old and die, does not pass away and get reborn." And now comes the part which is the kind of the crux of the sutta. "I say, friend, that by traveling one cannot know, see, or reach the end of the world, where one is not born, does not grow old and die, does not pass away and get reborn. Yet I say that without having reached the end of the world, there is no making an end of suffering." Let's just stop there before I do the last part, because he says that you cannot travel to the end of the world. You cannot find an end of all the problems in life by traveling to the end of the world, and yet you have to make an end of the world to find the end of suffering. Right? And this is an important statement, because what it explains to us is gives us some idea what the Buddha means by this word world. Right? So far we have kind of looked at the idea world. It's a bit like kind of the modern idea of the world being the cosmos or whatever. This is what we have seen so far. But here obviously the Buddha is talking about the world in a different way. Reaching the end of the world. You have to reach the end of the world. It's got nothing to do with traveling, obviously. He just said that. But you still have to reach the end of the world in a certain way to make an end of suffering. So what does the Buddha mean by the word world? And it becomes even clearer further down. What does it mean in Buddhism, the word world? And what it means, and I think this becomes quite obvious once you start to read the suttas quite broadly, that the Buddha's idea of the world is the world of experience. Right? What is your world? What is each one of us? What is our world? Are the sum total of all the experiences that we are these experiences that we have. So experience and world are the same thing. And when you add together all the experience that you can possibly have, that is really of all these other things. These are really abstractions. They are things that are first comes out. But which really concerns us is the world of experience. Why is that? Why is the Buddha focused on the world of experience? Because that is where the problems are, right? Suffering and happiness happens in the world of experience. And the meaning of life that there might be happens in the world of experience. Everything that matters to us happens in the world of experience. And the abstract philosophical view of the world and the idea from physics or whatever is really quite irrelevant to us. It maybe can be useful, but it's not immediately useful. It is this world that really is important to us. So this is what the Buddha, the world of experience. So that world of experience, there's many different synonyms for that used in the suttas. The world, experience. Of course, another way of looking at it is the 6 sense bases. The 6 sense bases: seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, and the mind. The world of ideas. If you add all of those things up, that is equivalent again to the world of experience. 6 sense bases, that's all there is. You can't really find anything beyond that. All our experience happens within that. Another way to look at it, often asked the very, I think, important questions: what are these 5 khandhas? And I think the reason why they ask that is because they have been taught very often, these are the 5 khandhas, form, feeling, etc. And then once they have been told that, they think, yes, and so what, right? And really, I think the best answer to explain what the 5 khandhas are, again, it is experience. Any moment of experience that you have will include at least 3, 4 of. So again, that's another word for experience, right? And remember, according to the First Noble Truth, it says that in brief, suffering is the 5 upadana khandhas, the 5 khandhas subject to clinging or subject to attachment, affected by attachment. So another way of looking at the world is suffering. Dukkha is another word for this, right? All of these things are really synonymous. Because that is, in the end, what the Buddha says. Experience is suffering. Getting away from experience, that is where everything ends. You attain nibbana, you attain the extinguishment of things. That is the end of experience, equivalent to the end of suffering. Another word the Buddha uses in the suttas is sabbang. Sabbang means all. And in the Salayatana Samyutta, on the six sense bases, the Buddha says that the six sense bases is called the all. Again, just what I said before, it's the all, because everything in the world, everything that you can experience is included within those six sense bases. That's why it's called the all, right? And again, it's very clear there that the Buddha is talking about experience being everything. Experience is the world. So these are all equivalent, and this is the important, one of the, I think, most important points of the sutta to grasp, is that the world is equivalent to experience, is equivalent to the six sense bases, is equivalent to the five khandhas, is equivalent to suffering here. All of these are just different ways of looking at exactly the same thing here. So this is what the Buddha means by the world here, and that's why you can't really reach it by traveling, because wherever you go, there will be more experience, right? You can never step out of experience, so to speak, by traveling. It has to be a different process if you want to step out of that. But you can't go anywhere because there will always be more experience wherever you go. So that is the first part there. So yet I say that without having reached the end of the world, there is no making an end of suffering. So now it becomes clear what that means. If the world is experience, now the end of the world will have to be the end of experience. And it is with the end of experience that we make an end of suffering. So this is why these teachings are so radical, because that is basically what they mean. Okay, so then the Buddha continues on this theme. The sutta has almost ended there already, but it is very rich in kind of implications. What continues? Actually, before I go on with that, one of the questions that often will arise, perhaps at this point quite naturally, is that if the world is experience, does that mean that the Buddha had an idealist philosophy? Idealism is this philosophy that everything is really in the mind, right? It's a very common type of philosophy that you find around the world. You find it in Buddhist philosophy. You find that in the end, everything is in the mind. And it's quite a natural philosophy, right? Because experience is the existence, there isn't really anything immediately apart from experience, it kind of makes sense to think that the world perhaps is just the mind, right? And is that what the Buddha is talking about? That everything is just mind? And to be honest, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I don't think there is any answer to that question. Of course, later on in Buddhism, you have a school called the mind-only school. So the whole school based around this idea that the Buddha... And then there were other people who argued against that, saying, no way that the Buddha was an idealist. And I think the problem here is that even that interest in that question, was the Buddha an idealist or not, is already missing the point. There was somebody who asked about this on Friday night, we're talking a bit about philosophy and all these kind of things. And I think one of the interesting things to me about the Buddha is that people often ask the question, what is Buddhism? Is it a philosophy? Is it a religion? Is it a psychology? And people have labeled Buddhism with all of these kind of words. But one of the things I think Buddhism is not, actually I shouldn't say Buddhism, I should say the teaching of the Buddha, because Buddhism is much more than that. But the teaching of the Buddha, one thing it is not a philosophy. This is I think very clear. And so once you get into this question, is the Buddha's teaching idealist or not, then you have already lost the point, because you're moving into the area of philosophy here. If there is a clear answer to the question, fair enough. But if it is hard to figure it out, then if it doesn't really matter for the spiritual quest, then it is irrelevant philosophy here. And this is, I think, a very important point, because I've always noted how how easy it is to take interest in philosophical points, to discuss it, right? It kind of stimulates the mind, and you think a subtle solution to the problem, not realizing, of course, that subtle solution probably is wrong anyway, because you haven't got the full picture. It goes on forever. Right, you're very clever, but not quite clever enough. So then you continue on searching, looking for these things, and you keep on arguing and philosophizing forever. And I think this is one of the things that the Buddha warned us against, is philosophizing. I was mentioning on Friday night the simile in the suttas, the Buddha, when he goes to the Gosinga wood and he takes up the handful of leaves, and he says to the monks, well, what is more, the leaves in my hand or the leaves in the forest? Right? Okay, well, obviously the leaves in the hands are very few compared to the leaves in the forest. And it says, well, just as the leaves in my hand are the teachings that I have given to you, which conduce to the end of suffering. And just like the leaves in the forest is everything I know, all the other stuff I know about. Right? So all the things I know is just vast. All the little things in my hand is just the things I've taught you. Why is that? Well, because the Buddha says, because these are the things that lead to the end of suffering. All the other stuff doesn't really have anything to do with that. And straight away, when I read that, I think, oh, it would be really cool to know all the other stuff, right? And then I understood, well, actually, that is probably exactly why the Buddha didn't teach that, because it is just too interesting, too exciting to philosophize and think about these things. And once you get into that, there's no end to the arguments and counter-arguments, and having to support yourself, having to defend yourself, your position. It's already enough arguments about the Dhamma as it is, but the more things you have, the more philosophical stuff you have, the worse it is going to get. And I think this is exactly what we see in the history of Buddhism. What we see in the history of Buddhism is precisely the human mind being interested in philosophy. Soon after the Buddha passes away, we start to get the arising of the Abhidhamma. The Abhidhamma is about dividing up reality into its minute components, both in terms of time, but also in terms of phenomena, mental phenomena and physical phenomena, dividing it up into the smallest possible constituent parts, and then saying, well, these are all the parts, reality is built of this, and this is the smallest time frame, and then you have the works which connects it all together and shows how it all belongs together. And this is really philosophy, as far as I'm concerned. So you can see how the mind inclines towards that. People looked at the Buddha's teaching and said, well, it isn't really complete, a philosophical structure called the Abhidhamma. And then, of course, they did the same thing. Buddhist teachings beyond after that was the same thing. There's lots of philosophizing in Buddhism, in the various different schools, and etc., etc., in Mahayana Buddhism and all over the place. So remember, I think this is an important lesson. The Buddha didn't really want to get too sidetracked by those things. The Buddha was teaching a pragmatic teaching here. He was teaching something that leads to real results. There is a problem to be solved. What is the best way of doing that? That is the Buddha's question here. And not philosophizing is not the best way to go about that. So bring us back to reality, not to be too sidetracked by issues that are not really relevant, and sometimes it's hard to know exactly, what is philosophizing and what is useful. So sometimes that's okay to step a little bit across the line, but not to be too sidetracked by those things. I think is very important. Okay, so anyway, so that is the idea. So forget about whether idealism is correct or not, or whether it's not. It's really, I think it's a red herring, and it's not something we need to follow up on at all. So then the Buddha says, it is in this fathom-long body, endowed with perception and mind, that I proclaim the world, the origin of the world, the cessation of the world, and the way leading to the cessation of the world. Right? This makes it even more clear that the Buddha, when the Buddha talks about the world, he's talking about our personal experience. Fathom-long body endowed with consciousness, that's the world, right? This is where we are the center of experience. This is where the world happens. It happens inside each one of us. We are the experiencer of the world. Fathom-long body endowed with perception and mind. You might ask, why bring in the body at all? Isn't it sufficient to talk about the mind? And I guess the idea is just that we are composed, each one of us, of 5 khandhas. The body is part of this. So it's just our experience happens through all of these 5 khandhas. And perhaps it also means that perception and mind and body are kind of the same thing, right? Perception and mind the whole body is really, I think the Buddhist idea of mind is that it fills the whole body. So when you draw the mind out of the body, you get another shape, which is pretty much exactly the same as the previous shape. So the mind really and the body, they encompass the same space, the same volume, the same air, the same area, if you like. That's a bit of a side issue, but I think this may be what is meant here. So this is where the world is, right? In this mind. This is where you proclaim the world. The world is your experience. This is where you proclaim where it is the origin of the world. The origin of the world is right here, inside each one of us. So what does that mean? And of course what it means is that, and I think you're probably obvious to you already what that must mean, if experience is the world, then whatever sustains that experience is the origin of the world. Whatever makes that experience continue and re-arise after it ceases or whatever, that is what originates the world and keeps it going, sustains it, makes it go along. And of course the things that sustains you in Buddhism is tanha, is craving. This is back to the second noble truth. Right? The second noble truth, craving is the source of suffering. As I said before, suffering and the world is the same thing. So here, craving sustaining the world, craving sustaining suffering is exactly the same thing. There's no distinction between those two things. So craving is a source of tanha. Craving gives rise to rebirth. Craving pushes us forward into this world and keeps us going around and around and around, until we make an end of that craving. And what might be useful is to have a look at how this works in dependent origination, because I was talking to the Kalyanamitta group yesterday, and it is quite interesting to see how the Buddha talks about this thing we call the origination of the world. Exactly how does it work? And if you take the view from dependent origination, I was talking about this on Friday as well, it starts off with avidya, ignorance, delusion, not seeing things according to reality, right? So the 2 aspects that I like to focus on with avidya or ignorance, the first thing is that we don't understand happiness and suffering. Right? This is the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha. The reason we have the truth of dukkha is because, we don't understand these things. So there's a Buddhist insight. It takes a Buddha to come around and say, this is suffering. Right? I have understood this. When you understand suffering, you also understand happiness. 2 sides of the same coin. So the Buddha is saying we don't understand happiness and suffering, but because we think we understand it, we think we're going to find suffering in the world, we go out, right, and search for happiness because we think we know where it is. So this is the first problem with delusion. The second problem is the problem of we take ourselves to be the agent in the world. We take a very aspect of who you take yourself to be, a very important aspect of that is the agent, the doer, the volition, the will, the chooser inside of you. I make the choice, right? It feels like an intrinsic aspect of who you are. I am the chooser, right? So you have power because you are the chooser. And you know where happiness is. If you have power and you know where happiness is, what are you going to do? You're going to go out there and get it for yourself, right? And of course, where is that happiness to be found? It is to be found in having beautiful, wonderful relationships, right? In enjoying yourself in the world, finding a nice job which gives you nice meaning in life, right? And then going out there and finding all this stuff for yourself. That is where happiness is to be found. Or you come onto the Buddhist path and you live a nice life as a Buddhist, practicing meditation, enjoying a bit of stillness and peace, and all of these things together. Wow, yes, I can make this beautiful life for myself. And this idea that we know where happiness lies and that we have the power to do it this is what then drives us and makes the second factor of dependent arising happen, which is the sankharas. Sankharas is precisely all that choosing, all the doing, all the agency inside of us, which leads to, the agency inside of us leads, of course, to its expression through body and speech, and also in the mind itself. Right? Sankhara, we want to create that world. I'm going to make happiness. I'm going to create the joy. I'm going to create all these things because I know where it is to be found. That is the delusion there. And I will show you later on what happens when the avidya disappears, because something very interesting happens when you do that. But of course the problem is that because you are the doer, in that search for happiness, sometimes we do bad things, sometimes we do good things. So when you do something good, right, because you think you are the doer, you have to take ownership of that. You have to take responsibility. If you did it, and you cannot get away from that feeling because it's essential part of who you take yourself to be, you have to take ownership. So when you do something good, you feel good about yourself. I did something good, right? Wow. You know, it's a good, you know what it's like when you do something good. It feels good, right? You feel happy. You feel a sense of joy when you're kind to others, when you do an act of generosity, when you have compassion and understanding for others. There's something beautiful happening inside of you. But when you do something nasty, right? Maybe you just have a bad thought. How does that feel? Again, you have no choice but to take ownership of that. So you feel bad about yourself. You are depriving yourself of joy, of lightness, of mindfulness, of all these beautiful aspects in the mind. You're kind of pushing yourself down. This has a direct effect on your mind, on how you feel. Either whether it lifts you up or it presses you down. Every time you choose, it will have an effect. So if you choose from the wrong motives, it's going to be bad. If you choose from the right motives, it's going to be good. So you are, depending on how you live your life, you're either helping to raise your consciousness. When I say raise, I mean bringing all these good qualities into being, or to lower it down if you do bad things. So you can see here, there's like a balance sheet, right? If you do a lot of good stuff compared to the bad stuff, you are gradually lifting yourself up. If you do a lot of bad stuff compared to the good stuff, you're kind of suppressing yourself down. This is the accumulation. This is exactly what karma is. This is the real deal when it comes to karma. This is how it works. It's incredibly obvious when you start to see it, and you can feel it in your own life. You can see the workings of karma right here, right now, called the dit eva dhamma karma, the karma which happens in this very life. And of course, if you keep on accumulating good karma, raising your level of consciousness, that means that when you die, you have raised your consciousness up, right, to a certain level. And because of that, your consciousness is there, your volition is now pointing, your aims in life, your purposes in life have changed. This is one of the things that happens here, right? You start off just indulging in sensual pleasures. One day you come into the BSW, you have a nice meditation, you think, wow, this is it. Why am I messing around with all these sensual pleasures for? I want to do meditation practice. This is the real happiness. Now I feel content. Now I feel satisfied. I didn't understand before what real happiness was. Your avidya, your ignorance is changing. You're becoming a little bit more understanding of the reality of the world. So your aims in life are different. Now you're aiming for these things instead. And you keep on meditating, right? So your aim is higher in a sense. So wherever your aim is at when you die, right? Aiming is always about the future. It's always about craving. So wherever your aim is at when you die, that is what your aim will drive you into that direction when you pass away. Your consciousness is at a certain level, and your aim relates to that level of consciousness. Because of that, you move in to your next life, following in the same footsteps. Now, once you move into that life, because the consciousness has a certain level, right? Once that happens, it means that the experiences you have in that life, they are delimited according to that level of consciousness. Right? So what I mean by delimited is it means that if you get reborn in a high meditation level like the jhanas, you will only have certain experiences that will correspond to that jhana level. Right? So very just happy experiences, right? All you feel is just joy and happiness. All you have is beautiful perceptions of light all the time. Your volition is only pointing in one direction. If you get reborn in a lower deva realm, your experiences will be a little bit broader. But again, they will be quite clearly limited. There will be you can only have so much pain, and you can have lots of happiness if you get reborn in a beautiful Devaloka, one of these high heavenly realms. In the human realm, you can have quite a broad spectrum of feelings, right? A broad spectrum of perceptions at a certain level also in the human realm. They tend to fall within certain limits. If you go to the animal realm, it's a bit worse, right? Actually, a lot worse probably, depending on where you get reborn. If you get reborn in a nice family looking after you, maybe it's nice as a pet or something. But if you get reborn as a worm in the forest, it's not very nice. So try to avoid that. That's one of the lessons from this. So again, you have a very clear set limits for the kind of experiences you can have as a animal or whatever. So this is what it means. Once your consciousness at a certain level, the other aspects of your experience are clearly delimited according to where you get reborn. This is what Nama Rupa, the fourth factor, is all about. You are set limits on your types of experience. Right? So this is what it means. And of course, once you get reborn in that level, that is your new experience. That is what the world is, right? So you have originated the world by the consciousness being established at a certain level. You have certain experiences. You have given rise to that world through this sequence of dependent arising. Suddenly the world is now what it is. It has changed from what it was before. If you die, if the consciousness departs from that body, then wherever you go next, that will be your new world, right? So your world, the world, by craving, driving consciousness into a new existence, that is your new world. The world has originated in that way. So this has quite important consequences, because one of the things, this is what we were talking about yesterday in the KM, Kalyanamitta group, and that is, the Buddha says that the world for the most part is attached to two types of philosophical viewpoints. Not really viewpoints, two type of viewpoints, not necessarily philosophical, it can be much more immediate than that. And those viewpoints are the viewpoints of annihilation, right? Annihilation means when I die, everything will just stop. And eternalism, on the other hand, eternalism is the standard viewpoint of most religions, that when you die, you will go on happily forever after, you will be sitting next to God, or you'll just be there forever. Right? Most theistic religions have some idea roughly like that. And the Buddha says most people in the world, they rely on one of those two views. It's interesting to rely on a view. I think this is interesting already. We all rely on views in life. And just to think about it, if somebody challenges your views, then you feel defensive, you know that you are relying on that view to some extent. If you don't feel defensive, you know it's not a problem, it's no issue. So keep that in mind. Views are actually much more uncertain. It is to me, it is a sign of a wise person, a person who isn't too sure of themselves, a person who has the ability to doubt themselves and to understand that their own views are conditioned and caused and can change at any time. Being unsure of yourself, to me, is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Anyway, so these are the two views. So now what we have shown is that the world arises, right? The world arises through how consciousness is driven forward through craving. So when you die, it doesn't stop. It re-arises or continues on according to this process of dependent arising. So once you understand dependent arising in the right way, you understand that the view of annihilation is impossible. Things don't get annihilated. Right? Because this process will keep carrying on, moving on into the future. It's like the craving and the volitions and all these things that you have built up, they propel you and project you into the future when you're about to die, because you're always looking into the future for something else. So this is the first part here, right? The idea of the origin of the world. So this is how the world originates. It is the craving inside of us, the volitions, the sankharas, that are the cause for the continuation of the world, just as they are the cause for suffering. There is no difference here. World and suffering are the same thing here. So then comes the third one here, the cessation of the world. That's also found in this fathom-long body. right? It is probably fairly obvious to you now what that would mean. Of course, if the world is experience, and we know from the Four Noble Truths that it is what drives experience is craving, so the cessation of the world must be the cessation of craving. So let's go through this process of dependent arising again and see what happens when we go into the cessation mode. Remember, dependent origination has two modes. The origination mode, where each factor leads on to the next one, and the cessation mode, where when each factor ceases, it leads to the cessation of the following factor as well. So what is happening in cessation mode? And what is happening in cessation mode is that when you see reality for what it actually is, right? You suddenly, for the first time in your life, you understand about suffering and happiness. You understand where happiness is really to be found. You understand what is truly suffering, right? So because of that, your attitude changes. Suddenly, you're heading in a different direction. And one of the things that you see is that rebirth of any kind is suffering. You don't want to be reborn anymore. Right? If you don't want to be reborn anymore, it means that when you come to the end of your life, your mind is no longer going to be inclining towards anything else. It's no longer going to incline to any type of rebirth, whether it's in the jhana realms or the sensory realm or the immaterial realm or whatever it is. So the mind is no longer interested in that. There's no craving for any of that sort of stuff, because you know that is not where happiness is to be found. Happiness is to be found when all of that stops. Right? So once you see this, once you see that there is no happiness to be found in there, the sankharas stop. You are no longer looking for happiness in that world in any way whatsoever. And because of that, consciousness is not established at any level. Remember before I was talking about consciousness being established at a level, right? Well, that level where consciousness is established is the level where consciousness is trying to find happiness. It's where it is its purpose, it's aiming for happiness at that level, wherever that might be. But if you are no longer interested in any of that, there is no level anymore. You have gone outside of this idea of being established in anywhere in particular. It is called in the sutta as the unsupported consciousness. Unplanted. It's not planted in anywhere in particular. It is unsupported, and it is no longer looking towards rebirth or looking towards continued existence anywhere. So what that means, that when you come to the end of your life, instead of the mind projecting itself forward into somewhere else, it is no longer doing that projecting. Rather, it does not actually want to go anywhere at all. Because it doesn't projecting itself forward, it means that consciousness is not going to any of these levels or any of these realms. So because of that, it doesn't take up any more nama-rupa, any more material and mental phenomena. Right? Consciousness doesn't move on. So if it doesn't take up any material and mental phenomena, what happens to consciousness? And this is why the Buddhist teaching is so radical, because most religions would say, well, if consciousness doesn't take anything up, it doesn't move anywhere because it's not interested in any of these things, it's not projecting itself forward anymore, then consciousness just carries on, right? This is what most religions would teach. But the Buddha says, no, it doesn't work like that, because consciousness and the material and mental phenomena are mutually dependent things. If you take away mentality, the mind and matter, if you take away physical phenomena, mental phenomena, and consciousness is by itself, consciousness needs those things to exist. It cannot exist by itself. There's a simile in the suttas with the two sheaths of reed, right? The two sheaths of reed leaning against each other. Now, if you take away one, the other one falls. Take away the other, one falls. They cannot sustain. It cannot sustain it. They're not self-sustaining. They are depending on the other one for standing up. So it's exactly the same thing. And this is where the radicalness of the Buddha's teachings come into play. Because when that consciousness doesn't have anywhere to go, because it doesn't go anywhere, it must cease. It must come to an end, because it needs the other stuff to actually keep on carrying on. So consciousness at that point, instead of being some independent entity moving on, it must stop. It was the opposite thing. I was before talking about the two views of eternalism and annihilationism. This shows that eternalism is wrong, right? Because it shows that given the right conditions, consciousness, seeing things as they really are, eliminating avidya, ignorance, which is the root cause of this whole thing. If you eliminate that, then consciousness stops rather than carries on. And this shows you that the idea of eternalism is also impossible. Things do not go on eternally. So what all this comes down to is that both eternalism and annihilationism are wrong. And you can see how dependent arising itself shows you how these views are wrong. You've probably heard these things many times before, why both of these things are wrong, and the Buddha teaches a different teaching, right? But this is how it works, and this is how it is explained in the suttas. There is a nice sutta, if you want to, which I read out yesterday in the Kalyanamitta group, where the Buddha talks about this in a little bit. It's called the Kacchanagotta Sutta. It's found in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Nidana Samyutta, which is the 12th Samyutta, Sutta number 15, Kacchanagotta Sutta, if you're interested in having a quick look at that. But again, it really needs a bit of unpacking and unraveling to be clear, because it's a very dense sutta as well. So this then is the middle way, right? This is another way of understanding the middle way here. This middle way between eternalism and annihilationism. This process which carries on until, as long as craving and the sankharas are there. Eliminate craving and sankharas, the whole thing stops. It's neither eternalism nor is it annihilationism. It's a third possibility. And this is what makes the Buddhist teaching so different from everything else. Okay, so good. So now we have come to the last one. And the last of these is where the Buddha says that the way leading to the cessation of the world, right? This is also found in this fathom-long body endowed with perception and mind. So the way is also found inside of us. And of course, the way is just the development of the mind, and of course, because the mind is within us, then the development of the mind happens inside of us as well. This is just a path of purification, right? Purifying yourself, purifying yourself, purifying yourself. It's a mental thing, until one day you're so pure, the mind is so clear, that you can see things rightly, you can see things according to reality. And that, of course, we were just talking about dependent origination. That is exactly what turns avidya into vidya, what turns ignorance into understanding, which turns delusion into clarity, turns wrong view into right view, which turns not seeing things according to reality into seeing things according to reality. Purify, purify, purify yourself until you become incredibly pure. No more hindrances, right? Go into a state of samadhi, come out of samadhi. Wow, now is the chance to see things in the right way. Then it unravels. Ignorance becomes knowledge, understanding. You stop craving for all this stuff which cannot give you any happiness. Consciousness is no longer being propelled forward, it's no longer being projected into the future by craving. When you come to the end of your life, it doesn't take up nama rupa, doesn't hold on to anything anymore, and it stops as a consequence. There's nothing more to support consciousness into the future. And that then becomes the path leading to the end of suffering. And that's roughly how it works. Okay, so I have been. There's a couple of verses. I'll read those out in a second. Is anybody not completely? Is anybody? People understand roughly what I'm talking about, or is it kind of muddy or grey, or is it kind of light grey or dark grey? Is it black or bright, or is it? How do you feel about all of this? Any questions that anybody want to ask? Stupid questions are great. Please ask. Okay, Drew. He is very brave at the back there. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Ajahn. I had a question, but I just realised that the four points he made is really the Four Noble Truths.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
The world,
precisely.
The origin of the world, the cessation of the world, and the wailing cessation.
That's exactly what it is. It's no different.
Same thing.
Yeah.
In disguise.
Yeah. It's just
My question was, it's a theoretical question. I know what you're going to say the answer is, but I wonder about the mechanism. So imagine that you were a nihilist and there was nothing after you die, which I was once. And then imagine you were suicidal, which I never was. And so your intention was to kill yourself because you said, that's it. I completely had enough of life. There's nothing after life. I'm happy just completely exiting. Isn't that enough to say, well, that person doesn't have any more craving, so it's unlikely that they would be reborn, because they're not craving to be born again. They fully believe that it's just over and that's enough for them?
The problem is that they are still looking at they are craving. What they are craving is to stop things, right? And that actually is a looking into the future in itself. So in a sense, they are projecting themselves into the future because they want to stop all this stuff. So it is actually a form of craving that is there, and that craving is sufficient to support you in this renewed existence. The point is here also that your consciousness actually has a certain level, right? Your consciousness is actually standing in mental and material phenomena to a certain extent. You still, if you could be happy, you probably would be happy. It's just that you find it's just too much suffering. You can't really deal with it. So you still have that problem in that you are actually projecting yourself into the future, trying to end things, trying to stop things in this way here. It's kind of weird, isn't it? Because it sounds like you might make an end in that way, but actually it is not really enough. You have to kind of, I suppose, understand the whole idea of cessation, how cessation actually works in a more profound way here. And only then, when there's actually you're not actually looking at anything in the future, whether to annihilate yourself or to sustain yourself, only then, when craving is completely subsided, can actually this whole process come to an end.
So the catch-22 is that you need a high level of consciousness, basically.
Yeah. It's terrible, isn't it? You commit suicide, and then there you are, right? You have to go on. It's it's really kind of, oh wow, this is. I don't want to be here. There was I remember one of the monks once said to me, he said that he had an auntie who was, had a very hard life, a very difficult life, and then he went to her and said, oh, he was a Buddhist monk. Oh, when you die, you're going to get reborn. And she said, oh no, I don't want to be reborn. I don't want to continue. I had enough of this, thing. It doesn't work that way. You actually have to see things rightly to be able to make an end of this whole thing here. So it is quite terrible. So for that reason, to try to end things, try to end suffering just by killing yourself is it is a nasty shock when you come out the other end and you have to continue, I presume. Sometimes maybe it is unavoidable, but it's probably much better to try to carry on and solve it right here, right now. Especially if you are a Buddhist, you have some good teachings, you have some good ideas what to do. Much better to try to resolve it here and now than to make a premature exit of this.
Thank you.
Yes, Hui Tong.
Thank you very much, Ajahn. It's very, very excellent and very, very helpful to me. I just want to ask something for clarification.
Yeah.
I'm simply adopting the Buddhist attitude because I have a very wise supervisor, very knowledgeable way of the world and the makeup of the world and the way to lead a life in the human realm.
Yeah.
And of course we have this discussion, and it's quite ongoing. Because he feels that consciousness is just a byproduct of rupa, which is the current mode of thinking. That all stems from all the standard model of the universe. Okay? And so he feels that unfortunately, because he knows I'm a Buddhist, he said, unfortunately, he thinks that in this respect, the Buddha is wrong. That there's no more thing beyond this life. And the way he relates to it is that he has come to terms with life. Citing his previous experience when he was young, that he has a very terrible sickness, not knowing when to die, probably going to die soon, and he come to terms that he'll live this life probably short way, and then die. And then leave a legacy. But just fortunately, somehow his problem was solved and he lived on, but he has come to terms with life. he'll contribute to life, and then when he dies, and then he leaves a legacy. And in this respect, he thinks that the Buddha is wrong. Unfortunately, he's wise, but he's wrong in this respect. So as a Buddhist, I listened. I said that there's no point arguing. There's no end to arguing. I kept quiet and come to this assembly and ask the question. What's the problem?
Oh, the problem is that he's trapped in his view, right? This is the problem. And he doesn't realize that it's a conditioned view. This is, I think, one of those. Maybe I should talk more about that. But I think one of the really useful things to understand about ourselves is that our views are conditioned. Our views are not certain. Sometimes it feels so true, right? You feel this is what I believe, and it feels so absolutely true. And yet these things are conditioned, and because they're conditioned, they can change so fast. I always, one of the things is people in politics is a classical thing, right? You're on the left side of politics, you're on the right side, and you find the same person being absolutely sure of themselves, and 10 years later they're taking the exact opposite view, but they're still absolutely sure of themselves as they were before. And you think, wait a minute, obviously the view is conditioned, and yet still that certainty is still there. So here, I think it's very important to be a bit more humble about our views and to realize that often we just don't know, and to say, okay, it's fine not to know. In fact, it's good. I think it's a sign of wisdom. And I think he is probably just caught up in the contemporary zeitgeist. This is what people think, and this is what the world, many people, look at the world, and he's caught up in that, and he cannot see that actually there may be a different reality. There was a very interesting article that appeared in Nature magazine. I think I mentioned here before. Nature magazine is the kind of #1 scientific journal in the world. And there was a leader article in there, and it was back in 2006, I think. And that leader article was called "The Mental Universe." This is in Nature magazine. This is the most high-profile magazine in science in the world. It had a leader article called "The Mental Universe." And I read it because it's available online. You can find it online if you look for it. You can print it out for your boss if you like. What this guy was saying, he was a physicist from Johns Hopkins University in the US, one of the top universities in the US. And what he was saying was that if we fully take on board all the facts of quantum mechanics, he said, we haven't taken it on board yet. We have all this, we know how quantum mechanics works, but we haven't taken on board all the consequences of that. If we take on board all the consequences of quantum mechanics, there's only one possible conclusion. The universe is mental. That's what he said. And it's quite mind-blowing that article actually appeared in Nature, because presumably what that means is that there was some sympathy for that among the editors, etc., in Nature magazine. And that shows you that even within the scientific community, there is more. There's more kind of scope for disagreement and for different opinions than might meet the eye. So look it up, check it out. Google on the mental universe. I can't remember the name of the guy anymore. And Nature magazine, I think it was 2006 that this article appeared. And it actually is available online as a PDF file. It's only one page long article, very short.
Sure.
But it's cool.
It's not more than a page in Nature.
Yeah, right. So check it out. And I thought that was very interesting myself. Of course, from a Buddhist point of view, perhaps it doesn't go far enough, But the very fact that is happening within that community is actually quite interesting. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I didn't want to engage in a discussion with him because it's lead to nowhere.
Yeah.
But I did just pose my question back to him as a kind of Occam's razor that adopting his position, then what in his view is what's the amount of material is needed for the minimum amount of material necessary condition for the consciousness to arise. Mm-hmm. And he didn't have an answer to that.
Yeah.
So he kept quiet at that point. Of course, I did ask him about the work of Ian Stevenson because he has a daughter who is very well trained in psychology. Yeah. But his challenge to that is that one is not published in the most leading psychology journals, some second, third class journals. So
well, it is impossible to get those articles published if you are on the fringe of science. Those more mainstream journals won't accept them, so it can't be done. So it is asking for them. He's asking for the impossible. So this is part of the problem there. Yeah. So yeah. Okay, wow, okay. Anybody else would like to? Anybody else would like to ask some more questions in here while we're at it? Yeah. Please don't be afraid of asking what you might think are stupid questions. That's all perfectly. That's probably very useful. Okay, yeah, Nicholas. You can bring it up if you like. Yeah, yeah. Great, thank you. Yeah. Yes, Nicholas.
So yes, talking about things coming into existence and ceasing coming to existence, and the sort of idea, I think you said something along the lines of things that arise have to cease eventually, and my mind came to samsara. Does that cease eventually?
Well, samsara, again, this is actually, thanks for that, because samsara is really just another word for exactly the same thing. Samsara really is our personal experience, right? There is no samsara outside of a personal experience. Samsara is not the world out there. Samsara is is our experience. That's why samsara is the same as the world, the same as the five khandhas, the same as this thing here. So there's no distinction between those things. So because it doesn't really, again, from a Buddhist point of view, it doesn't really make any sense to talk about anything apart from experience. Experience itself is really what we are dealing with. Anything else is, okay, it's kind of abstract. So for that reason, it's the same thing. So it will also cease when everything else ceases. Samsara ceases. It's the personal experience that ceases.
I kind of find that a little confusing because there are people that have become arahants, yet samsara for us still exists. So can you elaborate on that a little? Because
samsara is a personal experience. So your samsara hasn't ceased, but their samsara has ceased. Okay. Right?
Thank you.
So, yeah. Anybody else? Wayne? Yeah? Oh, sorry. Yes. Priya? Yeah. 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 Well, it's not the same. Bhavatanha just means that you crave for existence, right? You want to exist. So very often they are related to each other, because if you crave for existence, you will often have this idea of bhavatanha. Maybe I should repeat your question for the sake of the audience, but you're saying, is the craving for existence the same thing as eternalism, and the craving for annihilation the same thing as annihilationism? And it is not, but very often the craving for existence will lead to eternalism. Because you crave for it, you will kind of take that view, it must be eternal, right? I believe in eternalism. And if you crave for annihilation, you may take on board the annihilation view, because we often take on views that are emotionally suitable for us, or emotionally supportive of our emotions. Then it makes it easier to live, right? If our view is that cessation would be great, but actually I'm going to have to live on, that's kind of a bit disturbing. Cognitive dissonance, whatever they call that. So I think there is a connection, but it's not exactly the same thing, but they are related to each other. Yeah. Anybody else would like to ask? Everybody's happy? Everybody okay? Yeah? Okay. So we'll take some of the from overseas. So we have Lauren from the US. How can this teaching regarding to better deal with worldly experiences applies to personal suffering, such as poverty or lack of conditions to fulfill the passion to help humanity? Okay, so how can this teaching help us to the suffering of others? Well, I think the answer is simply that remember that in a very large extent the Buddhist idea is to overcome suffering in your own life, right? This is the main idea. You see that there is a problem in your life and you overcome that. But this doesn't mean that you are selfish. It doesn't mean that you are divorced from the rest of humanity. In fact, the very best thing you can do for everybody else is to become an arahant, to become enlightened, to become awakened. If you are an awakened person, you are a beacon for everybody else in the world. Wow, what is this person? They are different. They have some qualities which I don't have. I'd like to have some of those qualities. They are at peace with things. They can deal with all the issues I can't deal with. How is that possible? So you actually become a beacon for light in this beacon of light in this world. And when people see you, they are attracted to doing the same kind of practice. Sure, you can overcome poverty, you can help with all this kind of thing. That is great and very useful as well. But actually here you have the opportunity to help people in a far, far, far more profound sense. You can help them to escape all problems. You know, you help somebody who coming out of poverty in this life, and then they get reborn and they're back in poverty again. This is often what happens, right? You're not really providing any lasting solution. It's a bit here, if you're an arahant, you have a much more powerful and deep impact on people, both on the level of completing the path of practice, but also on the more shallow level of just being kind and being good in the world, because these beings are very kind and good-hearted, and it encourages you to practice the same thing. This is the first answer to that question. The second answer is, remember that the practicing, when you practice for the end of suffering in your own life, a very important part of that practice is being selfless. It's to be helpful to others. It's to be kind to others. I remember that there was a Mahayana nun, and she became good friends with Ajahn Brahmali, and they were speaking at conferences together and that sort of thing. And this Mahayana nun, she said to Ajahn Brahmali, "Wow, you are a real bodhisattva. We Mahayana people, we don't do as much good for the world as you do. You're the real bodhisattva, running around, teaching everywhere all the time. You have much more energy and much more effort and ability to teach people than even we who are supposed to be bodhisattvas." Right? So this is the thing. Once you start practicing this path, you actually give a lot to the world. You become much more selfless. This is part of the practice, right? To be kind to others, to be generous, is actually an activity of selflessness. And the less self there is in that, the more powerful it is. So remember that. So there is certainly no problem with reducing poverty in the world and to help other people. If you do that, coming from the right place, being motivated by compassion, kindness, whatever, you are actually practicing the Buddhist path. These are not separate issues. They all go hand in hand. So, but don't wait, don't try to solve all the problems in the world before you kind of take the path to its end, because the problems in the world are endless. And if you do that, you will never step out. You will never become this beacon of light for others that shows that a complete end of suffering actually is possible. Okay, so I hope that answers a little bit of your question. If not, you are welcome to come back to this at a later stage. So, next question is from Sri Lanka, from Uppal in Sri Lanka. Please explain what are the three sankhara, those that create the world, the kaya sankhara, vacha sankhara, and mano sankhara. Okay, so the three sankharas are just different ways that your volition, your aims, your purposes, your intention, they express themselves in different ways, right? So if you express that volition through speech, right? You say things, you have an intention. Oh, I want to be kind to this person. And then you express that through speech. Oh, what a wonderful thing to see you again. What a delightful thing for you, that you are here, or whatever. And you say something kind to somebody else because you want to be kind. Then you are expressing that intention through speech. Otherwise, you do it through body. You give somebody a hug or whatever, right? Or you just do it through mind. You just have a sense of loving kindness, metta, and compassion to others purely through the mind. You don't actually express it externally at all. This is the three sankharas. In exactly the same way, it also, in a negative sense, right? If you are upset about something, you can express it in the three ways. So that's really all it means. It is just the volition expressed or unexpressed through what is called the three doors. Are these the Tayo Dvara is usually called in Pali. Okay, last one from Adelaide, from Santachari in Adelaide. How do choices relate to cause and conditions? How can I choose to establish causes for good choices unless there are causes for that choice? That's the whole point. There are causes for that choice, right? choices are not independent things that stand outside the network of cause and conditions. If choices stood outside the network of cause and conditions, then there would be a self. That's the only way it can stand outside that network. So choices, the reason why you choose something is because the cause and conditions come together in a certain way, and then you make a choice accordingly. So it's a very good question, though. How do choices relate to cause, and how can you make sure that your cause and conditions are supportive for you to make the right choices in life? And of course the answer is simply to practice the Buddhist teachings in a good way. Read the suttas, right, and try to understand what these Buddhist teachings are about. Listen to some good Dhamma talks. Whenever you need a bit of inspiration, listen to a Dhamma talk that you feel is supportive of your practice. This is one of the most important things about Dhamma talks, is to inspire you, to carry you forward. Ajahn Brahmali is very good at inspiring people. He gives Dhamma talks at the monastery every week. I've been listening for those Dhamma talks for 20 years now. I've been a monk for over 20 years. And still, he often gives very inspiring teachings. You sit there and think, wow, this is really inspiring. And then you want to continue your practice because of that. So listen to inspiring Dhamma talks, read the teachings, reflect on these teachings. What do they actually mean for you, right? All of these things. And then that is how you establish the causes for good choices in the future. So that then when you are bewildered or whatever, you will still make the right choice, because you're pre-programmed, right? You make sure that you are a robot with a good program rather than a dodgy robot with a bad program. So that is very useful. So I hope that makes sense to you. So is there anything else people would like to ask before we call it a day? Everybody completely happy, content, and everything is good? Yeah? Okay. Let's just pay respect to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha.